Thank you for joining us. Really nice to meet you. Just to start us off, what inspired you to take on a career in the addiction field?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think it all goes back to my interest in the idea that there's a connection between the mind and the body. And one of the most powerful, I think, proofs of the connection is drugs of abuse, in the sense that you can take an exogenous chemical, put it into your body. It changes the biology of your brain, the neurochemistry of your brain, and then you think differently and you feel differently. So that was something that always fascinated me, was that you know psychoactive drugs are like a very strong example of how basically, as human beings, and one way to think about us is you can reduce us all just to neurons and circuits and brain structures, even though we feel like we're something bigger than that, and we are, depending on your perspective. And so that's kind of what got me interested. But then, I'm really like someone who, I wanted to go to pre-med and do neurology, and then I never, and I dropped pre-med eventually, and from there I continued with psychology, because psychology was very interesting to me and easy, and and yeah, and then went on to a career in research, as you guys might or be aware of. So it was a somewhat direct but somewhat indirect route.
So you mentioned that your profession mainly deals with research. How much research goes on about addiction nationally, and do you think it's enough?
A lot. I just went to a conference called the College on Problems of Drug Dependence. It's an international society of addiction researchers, and there's a lot of research that's happening. But since addiction is such a big problem in our society, if you take into account all the different types of addictions, not just alcohol or illicit drugs, but there's also tobacco, and then arguably certain behaviors like gambling, or even digital media use. And so each of those sum together to generate an adverse consequence on how long people live and how much well-being they experience. And if you total all that up, it's probably the biggest problem, the biggest public health problem that exists, and it's also a social problem too, in the sense that it can create inequity, because there are disparities between certain groups based on your income, level of education, your race and your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, and other types of issues, where some certain groups are more likely to have an addiction problem, and it's unfair and it's not their fault. And so, because of that, addiction, when you sum it all together, it is the biggest public health and social issue, in my opinion, and therefore uh, it warrants the most amount of research in terms of the funding, public funding, and private funding, and the amount of people dedicated to it. And so we need more.
Yeah, it's not even close to the top funded, right? I would assume.
Well, it depends on how you. I haven't done the math where you take into account, the tobacco work and the. But if you look at the different institutes, National Institute on Drug Abuse and the National, from the in terms of the major sources of government funding, and there's the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA. And so when you put those two together, I bet you could look it up to see what their total funding is. But then the thing is, the NCI, National Cancer Institute, they also have a portfolio dedicated to tobacco. So I'm not sure, but I know, and the Cancer Institute is probably one of the biggest, or heart, lung, and blood, which makes sense because a lot of people die from cardiovascular disease.
Interesting. So, as much as non-scientists can read your research papers, we did, and we could spend 3 hours asking about them. So we just pared it down to a few that were most interesting to maybe this target audience.
Okay, great.
You did one on how conduct and extracurricular activities, basically for younger high school kids, can directly influence, whether the odds of them becoming an addict or an alcoholic in the future. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We have a study where we started following a group of about 3,400 teens when they were in ninth grade, starting in 2013, and we surveyed them every 6 months. And we follow them all the way through high school, and of course, not everybody completes high school, and some people drop out, unfortunately, which of course is another addiction-related issue. And then we're following them now into young adulthood with our current active studies. And what we're interested in that study is looking at kind of the reciprocal relations between mental health and behavioral health and substance use. And, it's a chicken and an egg because they influence one another. People who have a substance use problem often, that can lead to mental health or behavioral issues. And so the conduct is one type of a behavioral behavioral health issue, like getting into fights, for instance, and skipping school, and other types of behaviors. And so we've done a lot of different studies based on this larger parent survey. And in that one study, we wanted to understand why teens who have conduct problems, we know it's very well established that they're more likely to use drugs, but we don't understand exactly why. And so one of the things we hypothesized, we made a prediction about, was that, well, maybe because teens with conduct problems, they're always looking to experience some sort of a rise, maybe some sort of sensation or stimulation. Maybe that's why they like to get in fights, or they thrill seek or break the rules, because they just might have a higher threshold or need to get some sort of stimulation, even if it's unhealthy. And so we figured because of that, then maybe that what they're not doing enough healthy things for fun. And so we know that certain types of activities that are healthy and fun, like being a member of a school club, or even things like going shopping with your friends, things that aren't substance related, they can be protective against substance use. Because everybody wants to have fun or feel good, and so if you don't have a healthy outlet, then you might resort to drug use. And that's what we found. We found that the teens with conduct problems, they had less of an array of healthy, fun things that they did, which in turn increased their risk to engage in drug use. And the reason it's not just important from a conceptual theory perspective, but it's also important because it gives you a target if you want to do prevention intervention to help teens who are really at high risk, and it's hard to prevent them from substance use. So we think that maybe prevention programs and after-school programs that would help teens get access to more healthy and fun things to do might prevent those kids with conduct problems from moving on to drug use.
It's really interesting.
Yeah, and obviously this study and many like it are taking huge strides for professionals in this field. Do you think there's anything to be learned by kids if they learn about your study, or steps kids that are prone to addiction can take if they hear about this study?
Yeah, and I think it's more. The study is reflective more broadly of a way that we look in our lab, and other researchers will look at drug use amongst teens, is that we think there's a lot of influences, and it's not necessarily a crazy behavior to want to use drugs. Now, a lot of people don't use drugs because they're aware that there's harmful consequences. But the motivation to want to experiment and use drugs kind of comes out of the desire to have fun, enjoy yourself, try new things, and which is a natural drive in a lot of people. And so my recommendation in terms of the way of thinking about how some psychologists think about drug using kids, and for kids out there, is that think about what are the healthy, what are the fun things that may be healthy, or they don't even have to be healthy. They could be like things like listening to music. They just don't have, if they're not drug related and they make you feel good and give you a sense of pleasure, meaning, and satisfaction, then it's going to reduce your risk or likelihood of wanting to do something else to satisfy that drive. And then, of course, once the drug use gets started, then other things take over, and drug use can be a means of escape or other types of issues. But we think that at the very beginning, we think that many teens are not thinking like, oh, I need to try marijuana for the first time to escape from my life. The first time usually is for fun, and then unfortunately when the addiction sets in, then it's more about trying to cope with life, and it's not as fun anymore.
So that's very interesting. By the way, that doesn't mean you can shop more with your friends. You already have enough curricular activities, Lianna.
Yeah, maybe there's some free things. Interacting with people is something that we know is pretty powerful.
Lianna's pretty full.
Yeah. I'm sure Lianna will be fine.
So, what on the same study? What would you tell parents of young teens? Like Lianna happens to be going to the support group tonight to talk to parents of at-risk kids. So, based on this study, what should she tell them to just load them up or get them some fun activities and outside of school and do that as quickly as they can?
I mean, I think so. And sometimes it's hard because there's financial limitations or there's other types of issues. Because, like a way that people kind of experience pleasure and fun or meaning or satisfaction, kind of positivity, for adults and kids is about social relationships. And so cultivating those, it could even be with your kids and the parents and kids connecting together, or amongst teens finding friends where they feel like they can connect with and have a meaningful relationship with them, which is sometimes hard to do. And then sometimes friends can be a negative influence, especially if they're using drugs. So it's a challenging thing, but yeah, in a sense, what you were saying, Mark, is what I would recommend, and then a lot of communication. And that parents need to be not so afraid to talk to their children about it, because it's happening. People are exposed, and children and teens are not naive. And even if they're not interested, sometimes it's just helpful because they want to talk to their parents about it to get their opinions and express to them. Because even if there's a teen who's low risk and is not really, some people are just, they're wired a certain way that it's just, they're not going to do it. And kudos to them. But they may have friends who they see, and a teen's be like, I don't understand why my best friend, who I've been friends with for so long, why now she's all of a sudden hanging out with these kids and they're doing X and Y. So anyway, it doesn't hurt to talk to any child, even if you think that there's no chance of substance use in terms of parent to kid communication.
So with a lot of these kids, at risk or not, especially in this age, there's a lot of like mental illness, like depression, anxiety, things like that. And you did a study relating that with substance abuse. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So that's one of the biggest risk factors for drug use is mental health problems, and unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma against people trying to express that they have mental health issues. Everybody has mental health issues of some sort, and mental health is on a continuum. It's not like a disease that you catch or you don't catch in most of the instances. It's not like a virus, right, where there's a pathogen and then you clear it out of your system and it's gone. It's on a continuum. And some people everybody has good days and bad days, and some days are worse than others. And then, unfortunately, some people are just likely to have many more bad days, or those bad days are even worse. And it's not their fault. It might be genetics, it might be stress that they're experiencing that they don't have control over, or other types of issues. So I think that it's more prominent than you think. It's not an isolated, small subgroup of the whole entire population. So it's almost like as if it's almost more of a rule than an exception that people who start using drugs have some sort of mental health issues, or like the other types of behavioral issue I was talking about, like the conduct problems, like a proneness to fighting or other types of things. And so it's almost like, just think about it as part of like the normative. If you're going to think about what addiction typically is, it's typically going to involve one of those as usually a precursor and often always a consequence.
I want to talk about one other study. Or at least one other one, maybe two. You did one on 3 generations, and I thought that was really interesting, especially since our book is focused on all kids, but a lot on family addiction. So you found some of the reasons for addiction going through all generations was trauma and emotional behavior from passing one generation to the next. Like there was an abusive alcoholic, and then the children would have PTSD or emotional issues, then they'd be prone to alcoholism. So that behavioral connection throughout generations, can you talk about that, and what did you find about the being actual genetic trait as well?
Well, I can speak a little bit more broadly in what you're saying is, that study, we looked at the familial transmission because it's one of the biggest risk factors. Is if you have a parent who uses substances, then the offspring or the child is much more likely. It doesn't mean 100% of the time. No, everything's like at odds, changing odds, right? And so everybody has control of their ultimate outcome, but just some people just have a little bit of it's a little bit more challenging, I should say. And so the reason for that, it can be 2 sources. The reason why it gets passed down through generations, and Mark, the study you're referring to, we actually looked across 3 generations, grandparents to parents to child, and you see that. One could be genetics, because certain people have certain gene variants, right? And so genes, most of us are all the same across people in terms of our DNA, all humans, right? But there are little spots where we vary. You have a C and I have a G. They're different molecules. And those are the things that make us look and act and feel different, even though for the most part we're pretty similar as human beings. And there's a couple of gene variants that might increase your risk for substance use. Some of the ones that are most interesting are those that actually can alter your response when you ingest the drug. So there's a mu-opioid receptor gene, for instance, where my colleague Laura Ray, a good friend of mine at UCLA, you'll be happy to know, Mark. And so what she's found is that people who have this certain type of a gene variant, which is not uncommon in the literature, if you give them alcohol to drink in their lab, they get more pleasure out of it, even if you give them an alcohol IV. And what she thinks is happening is that if you have this gene variant, you might have more or less neurotransmitters or receptors in your brain, so that when alcohol gets ingested, there's more combination between the receptor and the drug. So there's just more receptor binding, and the more receptor binding, the more of the euphoric response you might get from alcohol. And this is a story that we've seen with other drugs too, for different genes. And so that's one way. And so this is why it's a really important scenario, is that, you want to avoid using drugs, because you never know, once you ingest a drug, you might just be unlucky and have a gene variant such that when you use the drug, you get a lot of enjoyment out of it, more than the average person. And then there's other people who have genes where it's preventive, and so they might use alcohol. And you see this, like there's an alcohol dehydrogenase gene, and people, it's more common in people with Asian ancestry, where that they don't the metabolism of alcohol is such that it leads to adverse effects like flushing and headaches and nausea. And so those people, it's like they're lucky in a way, in the sense that when they drink, they just don't enjoy it. And so all that might be genetic. And then, of course, there's probably what's a little bit more intuitive is, family practice. You model. You see your dad drinking, you think it's okay at a young age, and then you go, oh, well, Dad did, I do it. Or, if your dad or your mom is not around, that's a stressful situation, and we know that stress is a big risk factor. Or even if your dad or mom isn't around because of substance use problem, they might, there's going to be less parental monitoring. And then, teens out on their own without, good communication with their parents and good oversight might be more prone to engaging in risky activities. So anyway, all those factors, there's so many different pathways from having a parent with the substance use problem to the kids. It can be biological, non-biological, environmental, genetic. And so that's why it's such a key issue, and it's great that you're tackling it. And of course you have, experience in your family, because if you had to go after one target population, if you want to prevent substance use, it would be children of, who have parents with substance use problems.
Yeah, very well said.
After conducting this study, is there anything that you think kids should know about this genetic link for addiction?
I think that, well, I guess probably what I already said is the most important thing. Some of the way the genes operate is that they make people more impulsive and more willing to take risks. And it's about willingness to try the drug. So it's really interesting in the sense that, some of the genes that make people courageous might also increase their willingness, and it might be a good thing, right? You have courage and you're a leader and you're fearless in some sense, but that in other senses, then you're more willing to take risks and you might use drugs. So, that's one way. And then the other way is that, the genes can alter how addictive the drug is for you. And so, what I think is that what children should know is that you don't know what gene you have, And so I would stay away from the drug, because if you use it, you may perhaps, unluckily, be more prone to abusing it or becoming addicted to it.
Yeah, that's great. That's sort of what we refer to in the book as the potato allergy, and we recommend, both Lianna and I, something similar. You don't know if you have it or not, so why risk it? If you know you have it, definitely stay away. But your grandfather might have been an alcoholic and you don't know it.
Right. That's right.
That's interesting. So that gene, is there, now that we're getting into, Illuminars down the street here, and, they're doing genetic coding and genetic testing, and everybody can spit in a cup and you can get your DNA in 2 weeks in the mail. Is there a hope of identifying in the future the specific genes that lead to that, and maybe doing something about that? Is that in our lifetime?
Well, yes, it's happening, but this is the thing. It's one thing if you're talking about some sort of like a medical disease that might be really closely genetically linked, like Huntington's disease, where it's always genetically caused. Now, if you're talking about like a behavioral issue, there's so many pathways that are mediated by so many different things, like your personality, or the more direct ways in terms of the way your brain reacts to the drug or other things, is that really if you try to say like, oh well, is drug use and drug problems genetic or do the environment, nature and nurture, it's about 50-50, like many behavioral conditions are. But the problem is the 50% that are genetics it's polygenetic. There's so many different gene pathways. You know, people who have anxious phenotypes, and then alcohol might help them calm down. For instance, other people who are looking for a rush and might be using alcohol in order to feel something, and so on and so forth. Or maybe sometimes genes. Yeah. Anyway, so I don't think we're going to get that, and I don't think that we should be looking for that, because the same, like I was kind of alluding to before, some of the genes that increase your proneness to drug use also are adaptive in other circumstances. Like I was saying, as being courageous and fearless, it's going to overlap with risk taking. So, you don't want to turn everything off, right? Because that's why, yeah. Anyway, so I think you get my point.
Throughout history, there's been a lot of really smart and successful, and they've changed the world, that have been alcoholics and drug addicts, and who knows how many didn't make it. But you're right, you don't want to switch off all those traits. That makes sense.
Right. Also, I think that regulation is huge, because, as you know, the legal drugs are causing a lot of problems. Alcohol and tobacco, and now marijuana. You're in San Diego. So I think to the extent to which that our government can put protective, policies in place to reduce access, because you want to hope that people, if you give them the information, they'll act in a healthy way. But it's hard. Everybody, how many times have people, as all of us, including all of us, 3 or 4 or 5 of us in this circle, know, and we're like, oh, I really shouldn't eat this ice cream, but I do it anyway, and then I feel sick, and I know that, it's and the calories are bad or whatever. Like, you're just human beings are going to make irrational decisions because they feel good. So that's why I'm a big fan of policies in place to inhibit people's ability to make decisions that are unhealthy.
Like the opposite of legalizing marijuana for the whole state, but yeah.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Like the opposite of legalizing marijuana for the whole state might be something better for childhood addiction.
It could, yeah. Or if you're gonna legalize it, then having these other protections in place to prevent child exposure. And so we could do a whole nother interview about that. But that's something that we're all gonna be working on, and as scientists, and also just people in the community and parents. So that's a topic I'm sure you'll cross.
Something that my wife and I went to a concert a couple weeks ago. Something that really bothered me. We were in the House of Blues, and there was the bar, and we went to the bathroom, and I walked back out for the bathroom, and there's a little kiosk selling marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
I had a little bit of an issue with that, so it wasn't selling it to kids, but now it's available everywhere, and so that's a whole nother webcast. But I think you're spot on. All right, Adam, we appreciate the time. That's you have some very interesting studies, and it's going right into the heart of what we're trying to help with. And if there's anything else we can ever do to help promote your what you're doing or publicize or anything, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, I wish you all the best in your pursuit to educate people, and I really support what you do. And of course, if there's anything I can do down the road, don't hesitate to contact me.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everybody.
You.
All right, you're welcome. Bye.